Today's episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is brought to you by Audible.com, a leading provider of audiobooks with over 180,000 downloadable titles to choose from. Get a free audiobook download by signing up over at audible.com/galaxy.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 172 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show we'll be discussing Jewish themes in fantasy and science fiction, and I'm joined by three guests. So first up we've got Jack Dann. He's written 9 novels and over 100 short stories, and he's also edited dozens of anthologies, including Wandering Stars and More Wandering Stars, 2 classic anthologies of Jewish science fiction and fantasy. He also co-edited Everybody Has Somebody in Heaven, Essential Jewish Tales of the Spirit, a collection of short fiction by Avram Davidson. Jack's new book, Concentration, a collection of his short fiction dealing with the Holocaust, is forthcoming from PS Publishing. So Jack, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Then next up we've got Rachel Swirsky. She was the founding editor of the Podcastle podcast, and she's a former vice president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. She's published more than 70 short stories and won the Nebula Award twice. Her second collection, How the World Became Quiet, is out now from Subterranean Press. Together with Sean Wallace, she co-edited People of the Book, a decade of Jewish science fiction and fantasy. So Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And finally, we've got Matthew Kressel. His short story, The History Within Us, appeared in Rachel's anthology of Jewish science fiction People of the Book, and his stories The Sounds of Old Earth and The Meeker and the All-Seeing Eye were both nominated for the Nebula Award. Together with Ellen Datlow, he co-hosts the monthly fantastic fiction reading series at the KGB Bar in New York, and his debut novel, King of Shards, which draws on Jewish folklore, is out now from Arch Press. So Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
And today's show is brought to you by Audible.com, a leading provider of downloadable audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from. I've been an Audible customer for over a decade and have bought over 150 audiobooks through the site. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy only releases about an hour of new content each week, and if that's not enough geekiness for you, you should think about listening to some of the great books that we talk about on the show. With an Audible subscription, you can get monthly audiobooks, even giant 34-hour-long audiobooks like Game of Thrones, for only about $15 each. Audible has a wide selection of fantasy and science fiction titles, including books by most of the authors we interview on this podcast. So if you'd like to give Audible a try, just head on over to audible.com/galaxy and sign up. You'll get a free audiobook download, and if you're looking for a good place to start, I recommend picking up The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, The Primary Phase. This is the original BBC radio drama that started it all. My parents used to have this on cassette tape, and when I was growing up we listened to it literally dozens of times on long car rides, so I can personally testify to its power to make time fly. It's a fast, smart, hilarious show that I think would make a perfect introduction to the world of science fiction audiobooks. And remember that these sponsorships are essential for keeping Geek's Guide to the Galaxy going. So not only will you be getting lots of great audiobooks, you'll also be showing our sponsors that this show is worth supporting, which will help us to continue bringing you new episodes. So again, the site is audible.com, and you can sign up for a free trial and get a free audiobook download over at audible.com/galaxy. Okay, and so I mentioned that Jack edited this anthology of Jewish science fiction called Wandering Stars, and I want to start out and talk about that. And so this is from Wikipedia. It says, in his introduction, Isaac Asimov discussed how many Jewish science fiction writers prior to that time had used Gentile pen names in order to get published. Quote, many of the Jewish pulp writers used pen names as a matter of sound business. A story entitled War Gods of the Oystermen of Deneb didn't carry conviction if it was written by someone named Chaim Itzkowitz. He then goes on to discuss the pen names of various Jewish writers included in this book. Wandering Stars is therefore of historical significance as the first science fiction anthology where Jewish writers openly identified themselves as such. And so, Jack, could you just expand on that a bit and talk about what it was like for Jewish science fiction authors in the early days of the genre?
Well, I think I probably came in a little too late for that because it didn't seem to be a problem for me, but the generation before, which would have been Isaac's generation, kind of, you didn't mention that you were Jewish, hence, William Tenn's pseudonym and I guess a number of other writers did the same. But, Silverberg, who came in after, didn't worry about that. So, I do think it was a problem, and I think that by publishing the anthology, maybe I uncovered it. But when I did it, it was not conscious. It was just, I had the idea to do an anthology of Jewish science fiction because it hadn't been done.
Well, say
I
a
don't
bit
know
more.
if that answers your question very well, but...
Well, no, but say a bit more about the anthology. I mean, what was your process for putting it together? How did you decide who to include, stuff like that?
Well, first I asked Isaac, and we went back and forth because Isaac, like myself, is an atheist, but we're both cultural Jews. So he was on board, and I used a spine of stories that had been published. And then I just asked people whose work I respected to write stories for me. I mean, it didn't seem like this was groundbreaking at the time. And I guess I was surprised at the reception.
Well, so what was the reception?
Very positive. Leo Rostin said, Jewish science fiction, the book is unexpected, delightful, and delirious. The English idiom, learn to talk, Jack. The English idiom is worth the price of admission. So it was a surprise.
Well, so why don't you just tell us about some of the stories, just what were they about, and how did people make use of the Jewish folklore aspects?
Well, Avram Davidson basically modernized the idea of the Golem, which takes place, if I recall, in Southern California. Silverberg wrote a story called The Dybbuk of Mazel Tov 4, which is about the possession of an alien by a Jewish demon. Harlan wrote a story called I'm Looking for Kodak, about the last minion on a doomed planet. So that's what I got.
All right, great. Well,
sorry.
Oh, great. No, that's great. So Rachel, let's get you in here. So you also did an anthology of Jewish science fiction and fantasy. You want to just tell us about how that came about?
Actually, this was something Sean Wallace had wanted to do for a long time, and I guess he had tried to launch it with a couple of other co-editors, which for one reason or another didn't work out. So he ended up asking me if I would be interested in, reading a bunch of fiction and throwing some selections together, which I did. I really like reading for reprints because you have such a vast well of, accomplished work to draw from. And he already had some ideas of stories he wanted to be in there. So there are a number of his selections as well. It's different from Jack's in that it's all reprints, and also it was confined to only the decade that was in question at the time, which I believe was 2000 to 2010.
And I mean, do you think that in terms of subject matter, was it similar, do you think, to Wandering Stars, or were there other approaches that people took in the more recent decade?
Well, I think that I think it's hard to say, really. People are certainly interested in what it means to be Jewish. There's still sort of a retread of common Jewish mythological themes in modern settings. I think Matt Kressel did a really beautiful job in what was one of my favorite stories in the anthology. Hi, Matt, I'm embarrassing you. Of talking about loss and genocide and the feeling of fragility as a people through the history within us, which is set in a far future space opera. Another thing that comes to mind is, what I thought was one of the most beautiful stories in the collection was Michael Chabon's story, which I believe is called Some Golems I Have Known. Golems, right? I have mispronounced that my entire life. I got yelled at after doing a recording for a podcast, and they were like, "That's not how it's pronounced." And I was like, "Oh, sorry." Anyway, so yeah, which is fake memoir or memoir blended with total fantastic stuff. It's all made up and blended together in this great postmodernist way.
Yeah, well, so Matt, so Rachel mentioned your story. Is there anything else you want to add about kind of how you came up with it or what you were trying to accomplish with it?
Sure. So the story's genesis was, no pun intended. It started. Basically, we were. My father had a bunch of old films from his childhood, these reel-to-reels, and he had recently converted them into basically DVD, and then my cousin, who was in videography at the time, came over to record a voiceover where my father was describing the scenes. And I thought, oh, wait, I work in technology. I'm a computer programmer. And I thought to myself, once something's in digital form, it is possible to transfer it without loss. So, when you copy a VHS tape or an audio cassette using analog technology, that you always lose quality. So over time, photos would fade, films would fade. And I thought, wow, if I take care of this and I back this up and technology, data storage gets cheap enough, eventually, we could get to a point where this might exist, indefinitely. And I thought that, if I ever have children or my ancestors or my relatives could pass that information on to their children and then add their own history to it. So that's the genesis of that aspect of the story, where one of the main character, Betsy, is viewing film footage from thousands of years in her past, which includes all of the history from everyone beyond that point, that person's children and their children and their children. It's all encoded in this biography. And so I was very interested in, and I think that other Jewish writers may identify with this, in this concept of you have this huge weight of history upon you, being raised in the Jewish faith, and this notion that, you are basically the voice or the presence of the Jewish people, like all that history for going back to, Adam toward, to you in the present, whether or not you believe in any of that as actually happening, if you're an atheist or if you believe that the Bible's literal or fictional, either way, there's still that immense pressure of history. So I think at the moment that I wrote The History Within Us, that's kind of the emotion that was going through my mind and the experiences. And it is one of my favorite stories, and I'm really happy that Rachel picked it for people of the book.
And it's really, it's an important and actually a very contemporary theme. I mean, the idea, especially after the Holocaust, and the idea that of testifying because because we are forgetting our past.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I think one of the things that I take from Matt's story, and one of the things that I find I end up writing about a lot, is not just the weight of the history, but also the feeling that that the history is very fragile, or that the present is very fragile. The history could be forgotten. You're responsible for maintaining it. And that everything can be ended very quickly, which I think is that thing that maybe for Jews in our century comes from the Holocaust, but certainly has come from a lot of different kinds of disasters. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. For American Ashkenazic Jews may come from the Holocaust in our century. Obviously, there have been a lot of massacres other than the Holocaust, even in the last 100 years.
Well, so Rachel, so you mentioned the Golem legend, and just my impression looking over all these lists of Jewish fantasy and science fiction is that the Golem recurs more often maybe than any other trope in Jewish fantasy. Do you guys agree with that? Do you think the Golem is the most popular trope, and if so, why?
Absolutely. I think that we actually see the Golem trope appear in stories that aren't overtly Jewish. like HAL in 2001 is a golem. The replicants in Blade Runner are golems. Battlestar Galactica. The Cylons. Anytime we have a creation that comes back to potentially destroy its creator, you're repeating the same mythology, the same story there. I mean, ultimately, the creator loses control of his or her creation, and it's interesting because if you apply that myth to humanity, we're God's creations. So are we saying to ourselves that we ultimately wish to rebel against our creator? I mean, you see this story over and over again. It's fascinating to me.
So on the one hand, it can sort of symbolize a rescuer, and certainly, again, a lot of American Ashkenazi culture still is in that sort of post-traumatic Holocaust stage. Like, a lot of people would like a rescuer. So when we were reading reprints for people of the book, there were so many golem stories, and so many of them set in the Holocaust where someone would be saved by a golem. This is obviously a very potent fantasy for people, But another thing is that I think the golem speaks to liminality. It's a created creature, created by humans. It's sort of alive, it's sort of not. We're not sure what state it's in. We're not sure, what it's... It's neither quite one thing nor another. It's not like anything else. When I was doing research on werewolves, I found an essay about werewolves often being used as metaphors for Jewishness, because again, you're trapped in that liminal space, neither one thing nor another. You can sort of pass for being a Gentile, except for full moon, you turn out to be not really. And I think the idea that you're in a liminal space between Gentile culture and Jewish culture is another thing that's very potent for American Ashkenazic Jews.
Well, I mean, Matt, you mentioned that the golem has even appears in stories that people don't think of as Jewish science fiction and has become kind of a science fiction trope. An example of that you gave on your blog was the story 72 Letters by Ted Chiang. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, I really like that story by Ted Chiang, but one of the things that struck me about the story was, it postulated this world where, and people who don't know the myth, there's this idea that one of the mystical names of God is 72 letters, and that you can use these letters in various permutations to basically cast magic spells. And in the story, the letters are used to animate all sorts of things. And one of the things that struck me when I read the story was there's no overt Judaism in it, but yet it's using very, 100% Jewish concept. So that to me was interesting, because I think that oftentimes people are using Jewish myths and themes in their work without being aware of it. Now, I know, of course, Ted is brilliant person and was very aware of what he was doing, but I think that I've seen it in other works where I said, oh, okay, I recognize that theme, I recognize that myth, but there's no overt mention of its origins.
We tried to reprint that story in People of the Book. The rights didn't work out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it may well be that Shelley got her idea from Frankenstein from legend.
Which is interesting. So actually, when I was at Anne Leckie's reading at Borderlands this weekend, because her books are so concerned with artificial intelligence, somebody asked her, what do you project will happen when they invent artificial intelligence? And she kind of laughed, because, I mean, what kind of question is that? You can't really predict these things. Otherwise, science fiction would be, accurate. And she said one of the things that troubles her in the discussion of artificial intelligence is this shaping of the idea of robots or artificial intelligence as being inherently a slave class uprising, that they are coming back against their creator. And I hadn't thought of that as having an origin in Golem mythology. And certainly she was discussing it as having an origin elsewhere. But I wonder, after this conversation, if I go back to her and I say, actually, the narrative might come from a lot older than you're thinking it does, that when we're looking at this pervasive trope in modern science fiction, it could actually have its roots in older mythology. I think that could be very interesting.
Well, right. So the golem, like we're saying, is I think the most common trope in Jewish science fiction. And then I also saw a lot of mentions of Dybbuks.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, Jack, you wrote a story called Dybbuk dolls. Do you want to just talk about the Dybbuk idea and how you used it?
Well, this goes back so far. If I reread the story at this point, it would be as if I was reading something by another writer. The idea was that the Jews in this extrapolated future were creating these pornographic Dybbuk creations and selling them. So that's really all I can say about this. It was because I wasn't using the Dybbuk in the sense that that Isaac Bashevis uses it, where it enters you. It was kind of this external creation, and it was a business.
Well, I mean, Matt, I know you did some research on Dybbuks. Do you want to just say a bit more about what you found out about the sort of the history of the idea?
Yeah, so basically the Dybbuks are souls that haven't found their home. So generally they're wicked souls. So the idea is that when you die, if you're super righteous, you go right up to paradise with God. But if you're, a little bit wicked, even though you try to be good, and most people fall into this category, you go down to Gehenna, the angel Duma, the silent angel comes and cracks your grave with his fiery rod and takes you down to Gehenna where you suffer torment. Well, sometimes you're so wicked that Gehenna won't even let you in. And so basically you get punished to walk the earth, essentially, until you're absolved of your sins by various means. And so a lot of times in the mythology, these wandering spirits will enter in people's bodies, possess them in the common sense of possession. And the way they enter a household, there are a couple ways they can enter a house, but basically religious Jews will put on their doorpost a mezuzah. So it's basically a little box. Most people know what it is, but if you don't, it's a little box, and inside is a prayer. And so if you have a mezuzah on your doorpost, the demons, evil spirits can't enter. But one of the tricks that Dybbuks use in evil spirits is to put an empty mezuzah on your door, a box without a scroll. So they get in your house, and how do they get into your body? Well, if you don't believe in the miracle of the parting of the Red Sea. So, that was traditionally a test of faith. Do you believe in the parting of the Red Sea? Yes, I do. So one of the ways to expel a Dybbuk from possessing you is stating 3 times that you believe in the miracle of the parting of the Red Sea. And there's other really cool parts, like when you exorcise a Dybbuk from the body, it flees through the pinky toe, I believe. It's really fascinating how these myths arise from these basically biblical interpretations.
Rachel, I mean, earlier when I mentioned Dybbuks, it sounds like you had have you come across stories featuring Dybbuks in your editing work?
Yeah, there are a couple in the book. The one that's most reviewed, I think, is the Peter Beagle has a Dybbuk in it. Is it Dybbuks? Anyway, my Yiddish not so good. I saw a lot of Dybbuks. I saw a lot of golems, and I didn't see so much other things. which got frustrating after a while because you're like, well, this is a pretty good Golem story, but I have a pile of 6 over here, so I think I'm good on Golems for right now. Matt, what should we be writing about that no one touches?
Oh man, there's so much out there. Pick up The Tree of Souls it's called The Mythology of Judaism by Howard Schwartz, and it's basically an encyclopedia of Jewish myth. And I've been using it as a reference guide for a lot of these myths on my blog. And there's so much. I love the shamir. Do you know this one?
No.
The shamir worm. So basically, there's a biblical proscription against using the weapons of war to fashion the ancient temple in Jerusalem. Like you couldn't use steel. Mm-hmm. So the rabbis were like, well, how did they build? How did they cut the stone without steel tools? So around this question evolved the myth of the shamir worm. And it was basically a worm that all you have to do is touch it to stone and it would crack the stone wide open. So there was even further stories to this where King Solomon enslaved Ashmedai, the king of the demons, to tell him how to find the shamir worm, which a woodcock far off in a distant desert kept tucked under his wing. There's so many cool things like that once you uncover it, you're like, wow, there's just a treasure of this stuff. I also like the Z's. So like most people know about Behemoth, the huge land creature. It may or may not have been an ox, and people know about Leviathan, which swallowed Jonah, right? But the Z's, not many people know about the giant bird. It was supposed to have its head in the sky and its wingspan cover the whole world and protect the earth from winds from the south. And its legs were so long and it was in water so deep that if you drop a hammer where it stands, it would fall for 7 years or something. I mean, it's just, I could go on, but I mean, the point is that there are all these unmined myths. Obviously, the ones that have the most resonance with where we are as a culture, as a society, or maybe the individual writer. I think that's what we are most drawn to. Hence why we're doing a lot of Golem stories, but Dybbuks stories. Also, I think it's just like people who aren't Jewish writers have been using these themes as well. Like we've seen The Exorcist, right? We've all seen 2001. Well, what's The Exorcist? It's a Dybbuk. What's 2001? It's a Golem story.
I guess I'm curious when we're saying, that these are Dybbuk stories or these are Golem stories. We can definitely read them that way. I'm wondering what other kinds of ancient mythologies probably have similar concepts where we could say, okay, well, this also goes back to the Babylonian idea of X, which may or may not be a precursor to the Golem. I mean, a lot of the world mythologies are tossing around some of the same ideas, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I uncovered in my research is a lot of times Judaism is repurposing these myths from other cultures. No culture exists in isolation. So, the Jewish concept of reincarnation, which doesn't really play as much in conservative and Reform Judaism, but I think it exists in more Orthodox version of Judaism. Is the word for it is Gilgul, which means like a wheel or cycle, which is just very similar to the Buddhist and Hindu notion of the cycle of life and death. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there is definitely that notion of ideas existing prior to the Jewish ones. But I think that what's interesting is that how Judaism interprets that with, using the Bible and the Talmud as clues.
Mm-hmm.
And
so
I think that's the nature of religion. I mean, the idea of the flood is certainly, in many of the other earlier Middle Eastern religions. And I think you're right when you said repurpose. I mean, I can remember being in a church that was thousands of years old, in Athens. And as I'm looking at the wall, there's a painting of Christ, except he was Poseidon, holding the trident, the whole 9 yards. So you can see how, religions just subsume each other.
Well, I mean, Matt, it's interesting because you're talking about how, like, these various fantasy and science fiction things are maybe inspired by the Golem, maybe inspired by the Dybbuk, but it's hard to say for sure. But you have some examples you gave of things that were very specifically inspired by bits of Jewish folklore, right? Like the Vulcan salute in Dune. Could you talk about those?
Sure. So I think everyone knows the Vulcan salute, right? So, Spock, live long and prosper. He takes his hand and splits the fingers and makes like a V shape, and the thumb is pointed outward. Well, this comes from Judaism, the priestly blessing. So, and I think Christians will be familiar with this as well when they say the prayer, "May the Lord bless you and keep you." So this was a part of the Jewish service whereby the Kohanim, the high priests, would bless the congregation, and with their hands they would make the Hebrew letter Shin, which stands for Shaddai, Most High, and they would basically make the equivalent of 2 Vulcan salutes, one with each hand, and form like a triangle, and hold their hands up over the congregation. Now, it was believed that when they did this, that the divine presence of God would come down from heaven and flow out through the priest's hands and bless the congregation. And it was also believed that one should not ever look directly at the divine presence because it could kill you. When Moses, the scene with the burning bush, God says to Moses, one cannot see me and live. So Moses cannot look directly at God. So it was basically when Leonard Nimoy was a boy, his father, the priests were about to do the priestly blessing, and his father said, "Don't look, it's bad, bad things will happen to you if you look." So of course, Leonard Nimoy looks, and he sees the priests reaching out with their hands like this. They have their talis, their prayer shawls, like over their head. It's this very mysterious kind of mystical thing. And so this image always stuck with him. Obviously, he didn't die. This image stuck with him, and later on, when they were working on the character of Spock had met in the script another Vulcan for the first time, and Leonard Nimoy says, I think the character needs some kind of gesture or greeting. Humans have a handshake. What would the Vulcans do? And so he suggested the one-handed priestly blessing. And that entered into pop culture history. And then the other one, which is really cool, is so people who are familiar with Dune know that Paul Atreides was also known as the Kwisatz Haderach, the shortening of the way, who basically could see into the future and do all sorts of powerful mystical things. But that word actually comes from a 16th century concept called Kvisat Haderek. So in the 16th century, there were a bunch of Kabbalistic rabbis that studied Kabbalah and were believed to have the power of essentially teleportation. So they'd be in a carriage and they'd be hundreds of miles from the village, and the sun was going down and the Sabbath was about to begin, and they were not in a good part of, wherever they are. There's wild creatures and there might be bandits on the road. And then suddenly they'd appear at the town. And apparently there's a lot of stories of these rebbes doing this, and it was called the Kvisat Haderek, the shortening of the way, almost the exact same word. And in my research, I was unable to find exactly where Frank Herbert heard that reference and then used it in Dune, but it's very obvious. I mean, it's almost the same word, and it's the same definition that he must have come across the story at some point.
Yeah, I use the idea in a story called "Jumping the Road," where the rabbis, the rabbis are able to basically teleport themselves, and I don't remember where I had found it, but yeah, it's out there. I think also Matt, you were talking about that blessing. I mean, I was brought up, in an Orthodox household, and it's really powerful. I mean, the idea of being, a young person and having, your father covering you with the talus as the priests are doing, are making the prayer. I mean, it does stay with you.
Mm-hmm.
And we all looked.
Did any of you die?
Well, yeah. Well, look, we're all going to die anyway, so I guess it's true.
Yeah.
It's a slow burn.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one thing I was just kind of curious about, Jack. Are you guys, I mean, did your parents tell you these kind of Jewish folktales growing up? I mean, was that kind of part of how you were raised?
Well, I can only speak for me, but my father prayed every morning, was Orthodox, but he sort of made up the religion as you went along. So consequently, we could go out to a restaurant and he would eat shrimp, which of course is not kosher, but I couldn't. Yet he wouldn't eat pork. But, we went to an Orthodox synagogue. I went to Hebrew school, was brought up, in the Orthodox, way. And even, now, as an atheist, I mean, there's a certain kind of poignancy and nostalgia to being in a small shul and hearing the Hebrew prayers. I mean, I can almost, feel, the dust of the desert. So this stuff, whether we believe in it or not, gets into our bones because we're brought up with it. At least that's my experience.
I agree with that very much. Like, I'm agnostic, leaning towards atheism, but I still go to the high holidays just to be with my family, and we go to a conservative synagogue, and there's very much that feel that you're connecting with something that's very ancient and very old, and it draws you in. The power of it draws you in.
Well, I mean, Rachel, do you want to say anything about whether you grew up with these folk tales or what sort of impact it might have had on you?
Well, I was kind of ducking. No, it's fine. I was raised by atheists. My mother's father was raised Orthodox and deconverted due to intellectual disagreements with the church, I guess. I think there was also just sort of a general being a Jew brings bad things on you. It has all of these associations with, blood and near escapes and all that stuff. So we're just not going to talk about it. We're just going to pretend we have a clean break. And so I have a lot of sort of sneaky cultural Jewish stuff. Like sometimes that I still uncover has a connection to religious stuff that I didn't even realize was there, or beliefs that are not consonant with most modern Christian religious practice that I assume is just sort of a cultural default. And then I'll talk to people who grew up Catholic and realize, oh, no, that's derived from the Jewish family history. But I don't have a great deal of experience with the actual following religious tradition stuff.
Yeah, well, that's baggage that you're, in one way, you're very lucky not to have to carry.
I mean, so one thing that seems to be a fairly common experience among science fiction writers that I've met is that they were raised religious, and then reading science fiction actually caused them to question their religion. Just learning science and learning about all these different ways of looking at things led them to question their beliefs. So I'm just kind of curious, Jack, you were raised in this Orthodox household. Did learning science or reading science fiction play any role in your kind of abandoning those beliefs?
Well, it had a top of mind awareness for me because when my father was a science fiction reader. He was an attorney, but he used to keep all of his Book of the Month Club volumes in my room. So, before I could even read, I would see the books. But it's kind of an odd twist because the whole idea of Judaism is to question. And the more I questioned, the more I found that I couldn't get a satisfactory answer. And there is a point I found in Judaism itself where, you're encouraged to question, but there's a point where you can't question past that. Now, I couldn't say that it was science fiction that focused that or that catalyzed it, but it was probably one of a myriad of elements that, that caused me to always ask why.
Okay, so I do want to get back to some of these fictional examples. I mean, I asked our listeners if they could suggest things to talk about for this segment. I got a bunch of suggestions. So Megan Smith says basically anything by Michael Chabon. She mentions The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay and The Yiddish Policeman's Union and Gentlemen of the Road, which started life under the working title Jews with Swords. I don't know, does anyone have anything they want to throw in about Michael Chabon?
Well, he did the piece that I mentioned in People of the Book that we closed with. He seems pretty brilliant.
I really liked the Yiddish Policeman's Union, not just because I take Yiddish classes once a week, but just because, one of the, trying not to be spoilery, but basically there's a concept of the, one of the Tzadikim Nistarim, the hidden righteous ones that play a part in that book, and that myth also. I use that myth in King of Shards in my novel, so I really enjoyed reading about that, especially the fictional Alaska where Yiddish was the lingua franca. That was pretty cool.
I think he's also called attention to the Jewish origins of superhero stuff.
Yeah.
Marlene Barr talks about that in the introduction that she did to Concentration, where she says, I don't know if I can find it here, but in essence, that the creator of Superman was writing it, during the Nazi era, and he was writing it in order to try to give voice and an idea of power to the Jews. So it was directly related to the Holocaust.
And I think the way they handled it, if I'm recalling correctly, in the comics, is that Superman went off to fight, but obviously they couldn't have him fighting in the real world, or he would have decimated the Nazi forces. So they had to write around that somehow. And for me, this is one of the more interesting, complicated grounds around Jewish science fiction, just because probably of the timing. Right around when People of the Book came out, someone had written an essay on why is there no Jewish science fiction and fantasy, which is, not deeply true that there is no Jewish science fiction and fantasy. But the author was making the argument that you have something like Harry Potter, which springs forth from certain Christian cultural assumptions, and saying that there isn't as much stuff that springs forth from Jewish religious cultural assumptions. Now, I'm still not sure that I agree with him that that's true, but the explanation that he offered for that, which I thought was interesting, is that Jews have a lot of trouble believing in something like Harry Potter wizards, who are these basically, well, they're not omnipotent, but they're very, very powerful forces for good who have utterly failed to bother to step in to ameliorate any of the world's massacres over the past century, and that the violence that Jews have culturally experienced as a group makes them much less likely to be willing to buy into that particular kind of fantasy escapism. One reason I don't necessarily believe that that's true is that there have been a lot of groups that have experienced a lot of violence, over the years, and I don't know that they necessarily all would have the same reaction to so-called wainscoting fantasy. But if you do think about Superman and the way they had to navigate the Jewish question, Or you think about Harry Potter and the way that, they're fighting the war with their Voldemort, but not getting involved in, the murder of 6 million, 11 million people. Then it does become a flaw with a lot of these narratives, or something that you can't unsee after a while.
I did find that quote, Jerry Siegel's quote, the guy who wrote Superman. Do you want me to do you want it?
Yeah,
please.
No, go ahead, please. Yeah.
He said, what led me into creating Superman in the early 30s? ... Hearing and reading of the oppression and slaughter of helpless, oppressed Jews in Nazi Germany, seeing movies depicting the horrors of privation suffered by the downtrodden, I had the great urge to help the downtrodden masses somehow. How could I help them when I could barely help myself? Superman was the answer.
Right, and I'm not an expert on superhero comics, but I'm pretty sure, were there two Jewish guys who created Superman, and it was Siegel and Schuster?
That's correct, yeah.
But Rachel, what you were saying made me wonder if there might be some natural affinity for Jewish people with horror, like sort of cosmic horror, right? I mean, because that would maybe seem like a more, like a worldview that's more consistent with the experience of the Jewish people down through the centuries.
Well, I mean, maybe you've got the werewolf stuff, right? So that one of the first modern werewolf stories, again, this is research I did a long time ago, so I can't claim that it's necessarily perfectly accurate. But one of the first modern werewolf stories is about a rabbi surviving a massacre and being the only survivor from his people. And afterward seeing himself as a monster, so that the werewolf is a metaphor for survival guilt. So that would be horror.
In terms of my work, I don't consider myself a horror writer. However, the stories that I have written, my oeuvre of Jewish stories, like Camps and Down Among the Dead Men with Gardner Dozois, and the Economy of Light, all of these stories are horror because, dealing with, that's a very powerful way, using the fantastic to try to deal with the Holocaust, which was so irreal that it's difficult to convey it in kind of realistic terms. So there I was by default writing horror. So I don't know if that goes anywhere, but I'm throwing it in, and Matt, please take over.
One of the things I see a lot is themes of loss, unfathomable loss. And, I think that's something that I was raised in a conservative tradition. I went to Hebrew school, and Holocaust was this thing that just happened, and it was terrible, but all I had was an intellectual understanding of it. And as I got older, I started to have more and more of an emotional understanding with it, and really what that meant. And I think that it's less horrific. Well, obviously it's extremely horrific, but it seems to come out in my work as, like, how do you deal with such a tremendous loss? How could you even describe it in a way that other people can comprehend? And I think that, yeah, there's a horror in loss, but the primal thing there is how do you describe something like that?
More grief than horror. I will speak as a counter. I have a friend who was raised in a conservative Jewish household. His name is Barry Deutsch, and he's a cartoonist and graphic novelist. And he really dislikes the conflation of Judaism with loss and the Holocaust, which, I agree. If you think they're the same thing, then, they're not. Although that tends to be how I process it in my writing as well. But for him, one of the ways he pushes back is by writing lots of humorous stories about Jews. And his majorly successful work is a series of middle grade graphic novels, fantasy graphic novels about an 11-year-old Orthodox Jewish girl who, a Hasid actually, who wants to learn how to fight dragons and get a sword. And they're just very light, and there's a lot of Jewish religious content in the background of forms of Judaism that aren't often represented, while still having sort of a quirky, light feel. And I do think that getting more, I think it would be good if there was more literature that wasn't just processing loss out there that was explicitly Jewish. But, speaking as a writer who always is processing loss as explicitly Jewish, obviously both need to be done.
Obviously that Judaism contains, much more than the Holocaust. It's just, for me personally, I think that the occurrence of the Holocaust profoundly shifted everything. And, the idea of supplicatory prayer, the whole idea where Jews feel they are in the world, and it brought out in such extraordinary terms, the nature of evil. So that has kind of obsessed. I've been rather obsessed with that in my work. So it's hard for me to step back from it, but certainly, the culture, the Judaic culture is so large that, there's room for, for many, many other things.
But Jack, you do have this book coming out called Concentration. Do you want to just say a bit more about that? Like, what does it include, and just tell people a little bit more about it?
Well, I have written a number of stories that are Jewish, and, some of them are not meant to be deep. I wrote a story called Fairy Tale about the unseelie court invading the Borscht Belt, and it's told from the perspective of a stand-up Jewish comedian. But there's a number of stories I've written that explore the nature of the Holocaust, and I collected them into this collection called Concentration. One of the stories, and then I'll get off the podium here, that might be of interest. It's a story called The Economy of Light, which was also published as a separate short novel. And I was at a picnic with Lucius Shepard, and we were talking about a story he wrote called Mengele. I don't know if anybody remembers that. And as we were talking, he looked at me and he said, well, what if Mengele completely changed his life? What if he escaped and lived the life of a Schweitzer? If you found him, would you kill him? And that was, that's why I wrote the story, The Economy of Light, which is about a guy who was in the camps, was one of the children that he tortured, and Mengele had killed his brother. And I have Mengele escape, to South America and actually become a kind of Schweitzer figure. And I put my protagonist in front of him with that option. Does he kill him? That moral question. And it's the question of, can people, truly change? And I didn't, while I was writing it, I was writing it to find out, how I felt about that kind of ambiguity. And it basically took me 15 years to write the story because I couldn't end it. And then finally, a number of years ago, I saw the ending and I wrote the story. A couple of the stories in the book are ambiguous in that way. There's another story called T, which is not a science fiction story, but, Gardner published it in Asimov's basically because he liked it. But the idea was this old lady has tea every Wednesday with this fellow, and then she hears the rumor that he had been, a Nazi and might be sought after for war crimes. And the question there is, what does she do? And what she ends up doing is she still has tea with him every Wednesday. I find that I'm ambiguous with a lot of my feelings, and so, I've been trying to sort them out, and I really do feel that the fantastic, that fabulation, that magical realism, SF, all of that is a way that we can talk about events that mimetic fiction can't touch.
Okay, so unfortunately we're way over time here, so we need to start wrapping things up. But Matt, I definitely want to give you a chance to talk about King of Shards. So why don't you just tell people about King of Shards?
Sure. King of Shards, my novel comes out October 13th, and it is based on the myth of the Lamed Vav. If you're not familiar with the myth, it states that there are 36 hidden righteous people that sustain the world. If any one of those hidden saints cease to be righteous, the world will be destroyed. Also, the interesting thing about it is that these saints are so anonymous that you or I could be one of these saints. So as you're walking along the street, you might run into one of these Lamed Vavniks. In King of Shards, demons discover who these Lamed Vavniks are and try to kill them one by one in order to bring about the destruction of the earth. Daniel Fisher discovers he's a Lamed Vav. He teams up with Ashmedai, the king of the demons, in order to defeat other demons who have kicked him out of hell. The myth also, the book also uses the myth of the shattered vessels of creation. I didn't really talk about this today, but the idea is that ours wasn't the first universe that God created. He created other universes, and they displeased him, so he smashed them. Their fragments exist throughout the cosmos, essentially, and it is our job as human beings to uplift these fallen sparks by being righteous. In King of Shards, I posit that what if these early universes weren't empty when God smashed them? What if they had creatures existing on them? And so I said that demons had lived on these worlds. And, when God smashed them, most of them died, but a few of them survived, and they're really pissed. So that's where the King of Shards comes from, and that's my little spiel about the book.
It sounds terrific.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, and Matt, say the thing about Ashmedai weeping when he sees the guy's shoes. I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, so there's a lot of stories, apocryphal stories of Ashmedai, who's the king of the demons, and in one of the stories, he's walking past a wedding, and he sees the groom's shoes, and he begins weeping, and the one who's walking with him says, "Why are you weeping?" He said, the groom won't live through the day; he's going to die within a day. And I thought to myself, wow, in this myth, the king of demon kind is weeping. We often have this vision of demons as being these completely, evil, ruthless, full of vengeance. But, here was a sensitive side of a demon. And I thought, that's who I want to write. I want to write the sensitive demon. Yeah, he's angry. He's really pissed at what God did to his universe, but he's got a sensitive side. So I almost want you to, I do want you to empathize with him to a point. But at some point, he is the king of the demons, right? I won't say any more without spoiling the book, but I wanted to craft a villain that you didn't entirely hate.
Well, sort of like the portrayal in Paradise Lost of Satan, who has, his a kind of sympathetic side. Now, the book sounds terrific, buddy.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
It's out now?
It will come out October 13th. So
Awesome.
it will be out when this airs.
All right, so everybody go check that out. And so, Rachel, we're out of time, but do you have any last words? Anything else you want to mention?
Yeah, I wanted to mention very briefly, just because we didn't really cover global Jewish science fiction, and I certainly can't in a breath, but there is a fantasy scene in Israel, although a lot of it I think takes place in English and some of it over here. Levi Tidhar is a great person to check out. And there are some Jews writing about the modern Israeli-Palestine situation, not necessarily from a Zionist perspective. One of those who does not write from a Zionist perspective is Ben Burgess, and some of his fiction does take on displacement and other issues that are going on with the current Israeli government.
All right, yeah, I have a whole list of stuff I didn't get a chance to bring up, but I'll just direct people quickly to, I did come across a list on Amazon.com called Jewish Science Fiction and Fantasy by Rabbi Yonasan Gershom. He's also the author of the book Jewish Themes in Star Trek. So if you're looking for more material on this theme, definitely check out that list. But I think otherwise we're going to have to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Jack Dann and Rachel Swirsky and Matt Kressel. So guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. This was great. Thanks.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Jack Dann, Rachel Swirsky, and Matthew Kressel for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Rory Carroll in Ireland, who writes, "Great show. I'm a huge sci-fi fan who happens to have worked in radio and TV for over 10 years. I think that as well as creating a show that has helped me discover amazing new authors, David has the ability to know when to keep quiet and let his guests do the talking. Often presenters want to impress their listeners with their own knowledge. David obviously has that, but he doesn't show off. A+. So big thanks again to Rory Carroll for that great review. And of course a special thank you to Carlos Maison, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd prefer to make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank audible.com for sponsoring today's show. For a free audiobook download, visit audible.com/galaxy. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.